Only $1. I guess Grandma finally told everyone what you were worth.
Take my advice. Accept it and walk away.
If this was her final decision, I will respect it.
None of this key belongs only to you.
This place, it still exists.
Your grandmother never lost it. She protected it for you.
Why didn't anyone tell me?
Because no one else was ever meant to find this place. $10 million. Walk away today and you'll never have to work again.
My grandmother already discovered my price. It wasn't $10 million.
You're making the biggest mistake of your life.
She gave me $1 to prove I could never be bought.
You don't belong in that chair.
According to the trust documents, she is the controlling shareholder.
Is that even possible? This chair never belonged to power. It belonged to responsibility.
You have no idea what it takes to run this company.
The audit has finished. Every transaction has now been verified. These records, they're all authentic.
The company was never yours to protect. It was yours to betray.
The whole room erupted in laughter the moment the lawyer read that Naomi Cole had inherited exactly $1. Her half-sister held up her own check for $2 million. Called Naomi the freeloader, their grandmother had finally exposed for what she was, and the rest of the family joined right in. Naomi held herself together as long as she could, but her eyes filled when they mocked her altered black dress and the furniture restoration shop she had spent years building from nothing. Then attorney Silas Grant closed the leather portfolio, walked across the room, and pressed a brass key into her palm. With the quiet gravity of a man who had been waiting a long time to do exactly that, he said only, "Mrs. Sterling left you something they were never meant to know about. If you want to watch Naomi turn $1 into the move that silenced an entire dynasty, hit subscribe now." The morning Vivienne Sterling was buried, the fog over Belhaven, Virginia sat low enough to swallow the tops of the old oak trees that lined the Sterling Estate Road, and Naomi Cole drove through it alone, in a 10-year-old car she had restored herself from a shell she found in a salvage yard. She had pressed the black dress the night before, taken in the waist by hand, because the original cut had never fit her properly, and she had allowed herself exactly 30 minutes to feel whatever she needed to feel, before she crossed the county line, after which she drove the rest of the way with her jaw set and her hand steady on the wheel. The security guard at the front gate asked for identification before he lifted the barrier. He had not asked Conrad Sterling for identification. He had not asked Sloan. The cars belonging to the main branch of the Sterling family had simply been waved through with something close to a bow, and so Naomi stood at the gate with her driver's license extended toward a man in a Navy uniform, who looked at her face, and then at the document, and then at her face again, the way people do when they are deciding whether the answer they have been given matches the one they expected. Inside the estate, Celeste Sterling intercepted Naomi in the entrance hall, with the particular brand of surprise that is not really surprise at all, but a performance of it, a raised eyebrow, and a murmured remark about how Vivienne had been so thoughtful to include everyone. She said the word everyone with the soft emphasis of a woman who wanted Naomi to understand that everyone was a courtesy extended from above, not a right that existed by itself. Celeste had been married to Julian Sterling for 11 years before his death, and had spent those years maintaining the quiet understanding that Naomi, Julian's daughter from a relationship the family preferred not to discuss, was a guest in the story they were telling about themselves, never a character who belonged in it. She touched the pearls at her throat and said she hoped Naomi would not find the occasion too overwhelming, which was the kind of sentence that sounds like concern and functions like a warning. Sloan found her before the service began and delivered her greeting with the particular warmth of a surgeon making an incision. She had the kind of beauty that comes from sustained investment, the right clothes on the right frame, maintained at significant ongoing expense, and she used it the way she used everything, as a tool for establishing where the lines were. She reminded Naomi, in the gentlest possible tone, that there had once been an offer of a position at Sterling Group's communications division, a real position with a salary and a future, and that Naomi had turned it down to keep working with old furniture in a rented workshop in a part of the city no one important lived in. The implication was not subtle. Sloan believed Naomi had appeared that morning not because she was grieving, but because she had done the arithmetic and shown up accordingly, and she wanted Naomi to know she had been seen through, right down to the hem of her altered dress. Naomi did not respond. She stood in the entrance hall of the estate her grandmother had built and let the words move past her, the way she had learned to let certain things move past her. The way water moves around a stone without actually touching it. She thought instead about the last time she had seen Vivian Sterling in person, 6 months before the end, when the old woman had appeared without announcement at the workshop and stood for a long time watching Naomi work on a water-damaged writing desk that a client had found in a storage unit. Vivian had asked only one question before she left. When a piece of furniture is discarded by the family that owned it, do you see trash or do you see history? Naomi had told her she saw something that could still be saved. Vivian had not responded. She had simply looked at Naomi for a long moment, with an expression Naomi had never been able to fully read, and then she had gone. The service was held in the main reception room. Naomi was escorted to the last row of chairs, a position that placed her at the maximum possible distance from the front of the room without her technically being in the hallway. Sloane had arrived before her and placed a designer bag on the chair, directly to Naomi's right, occupying it with luggage rather than a person. Conrad Sterling, who was 58 years old, gray at the temples, and accustomed to rooms organizing themselves around his presence, referred to Naomi during the pre-service gathering, not as Vivian's granddaughter, but as a family guest, which was a distinction that everyone in the room understood and no one corrected. Celeste caught Naomi's eye once during the service and held it just long enough to communicate that any kind of scene would be remembered and held against her. Naomi looked away first, not because she was afraid, but because she had not come to Belhaven to fight in the entrance hall of a dead woman's estate. When the service concluded and the family was directed toward the study for the reading of the will, Silas Grant entered carrying 2 briefcases. He was 67 years old and had the unhurried precision of a man who had spent 4 decades making sure that what needed to happen happened correctly, without decoration and without error. He placed the larger case on the conference table in front of Conrad. He placed the smaller one, black leather, plain brass fittings, directly beside Naomi's chair at the end of the table. No one in the room appeared to notice the second case. They were looking at the large one, at Silas, at their own names waiting to be read aloud and confirmed in the presence of witnesses. Silas read the public distribution with the even cadence of a man reciting figures he had long since stopped being surprised by. Sloane Sterling received $2 million and operational authority over the Sterling Family Foundation. Everett Sterling received a coastal resort property and a percentage stake in a hospitality subsidiary. Celeste Sterling retained the family home she currently occupied and a lifetime maintenance allowance funded through a dedicated account. Conrad Sterling received temporary management rights over a substantial portion of the group's commercial holdings, along with a governing role on the Asset Committee, a position that fell just short of permanent authority, a distinction that would only become relevant later. Each name was read and received with the particular satisfaction of people who had been expecting good news and received it. Conrad settled deeper into his chair after his name was read, the physical posture of a man who has decided that the proceedings have confirmed what he already knew, and began to behave in the quiet, practical way of someone who considers a matter closed. Then Silas read the name Naomi Cole. The room adjusted. Sloane stopped examining her fingernails. Conrad turned his head a degree. Celeste stilled completely. Silas stated, in the same unhurried tone he had used for the others, that Vivian Sterling had elected to bequeath to her granddaughter Naomi Cole the sum of $1, payable immediately upon acceptance. The room was silent for perhaps 4 seconds. Then Sloane laughed, not the polite laugh of someone caught off guard, but the full laugh of someone who has been waiting for a particular outcome and is genuinely delighted to receive it. She held up her own distribution summary and asked, with a brightness that filled the corners of the room, whether Naomi needed help covering the cost of the drive home. Celeste said that Vivian had spent her entire life building something real, and that the will had simply confirmed what the family had always understood, that Naomi had never been, in any meaningful sense, a Sterling. Conrad produced what he no doubt considered a magnanimous expression and offered to write Naomi a personal check for several $1,000s if she would sign a single document, confirming she had no intention of challenging the estate. He said it the way you offer a transit token to someone who cannot afford a cab, a kindness being done to a person in a lesser position, which is not the same thing as respect. Naomi felt the pain of it deep and precise. Not the pain of losing money, but the pain of a hypothesis confirmed. That Vivienne, in the end, had seen what everyone else in this family saw when they looked at her. She sat with that for exactly as long as it took Silas to place the dollar coin on the table in front of her. Then she picked it up. She told the room that if this was her grandmother's final judgment, she would honor it, and she meant it. Because she had not come to Belhaven to perform grief for an audience, and she had not come to argue with a dead woman's choices. She set the coin in the front pocket of her bag and folded her hands in her lap. Around the table, people began congratulating one another. The cheerful transaction of people distributing what they have agreed they deserve. Silas watched Naomi during this, and something he checked quietly in the Hawk folder on the table beside him appeared to satisfy a requirement he had been tracking. He asked Naomi, in a voice low enough for only her to hear, to remain seated after the others had gone. When Conrad rose to organize the departure, Silas informed him with complete courtesy that the session was not yet concluded, that a secondary instrument existed under a separate trust mechanism, and that the terms of that instrument excluded non-beneficiaries from the room during its disclosure. Conrad's composure shifted in the way that expensive composure does when it is genuinely surprised. A tightening around the eyes, a fractional pause before the response. He said there was no second instrument. Silas said there was. The group's own legal representative, seated 2 chairs down, confirmed that the trust in question predated Conrad's involvement in estate planning by more than a decade and fell entirely outside his authority to contest or attend. Conrad stood in the doorway for a moment that lasted longer than it should have, and then the door closed behind him. Silas opened the smaller black briefcase. He removed a key, brass, old, heavier than it looked, with a metal tag engraved with 2 words, Ravenwood, East Door. He set it on the table in front of Naomi. Before they left the building, he told her quietly that the family believed Ravenwood had been demolished and sold 18 years ago, and that Vivienne had spent a great deal of money over the years making sure they continued to believe exactly that. They drove north out of Belhaven on a road that did not appear on the standard mapping service. Silas did not speak much, which Naomi came to understand was not indifference, but discipline. The restraint of a man who knew that what he was about to show her would answer questions more efficiently than anything he could say in a moving car. He explained the trust's structure while they drove. Vivienne had established a living trust called the $1 Trust more than a decade before her death, naming a conditional beneficiary whose identity would only activate upon the specific sequence of events that had just occurred. The dollar was not a punishment, it was a mechanism, requiring that the named beneficiary accept the bequest voluntarily, without foreknowledge of what lay behind it, and without making threats or demands. If Naomi had taken Conrad's money, challenged the will, or simply refused the dollar and walked away, the activation sequence would have failed, and a preservation foundation with no connection to the Sterling family would have received everything. The fact that she had accepted a dollar in front of people laughing at her and said she would honor the decision was the test. The fact that she had passed it was why they were on this road. The car stopped before a gate set into a stone wall half consumed by climbing ivy. Naomi used the key. The gate opened inward on well-maintained hinges. Someone had been caring for the mechanism regularly, and what lay on the other side of it stopped her breathing for a moment. Ravenwood Estate was a Georgian revival house, set on 40 acres of grounds that ran down to a private lake, the kind of property that does not exist in a person's imagination, because their imagination has not had occasion to build it. The facade was intact. The grounds were kept. The windows caught the afternoon light and returned it without apology. Naomi had been told by various members of the Sterling family over the course of her life that the original estate had burned in her childhood and the land had been sold to a developer. She had no reason at the time to doubt this. Vivienne had purchased the property back through a third party before Naomi was 10 years old. had spent several years restoring it, and had then quietly removed it from every public record associated with Sterling Group, housing it inside the trust structure Silas had just described. Marlene Hayes met them at the front door. She was 62, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades being underestimated by people who confused quietness with absence of intelligence. She did not greet Naomi as a guest. She used a specific word, owner, and the word landed in Naomi's chest in a way that made her stand very still for a moment, the way you stand still when something you did not know you were waiting for finally arrives. Silas walked her through the numbers without ornamentation. The property was unencumbered, meaning no mortgage, no lien, no obligation attached to the land itself. The contents of the house, including a documented collection of historical Sterling Group materials, belonged to the trust. The acreage was fully deeded. The preliminary valuation exceeded the combined cash value of everything Sloan and Everett had received. Naomi said she understood the house was valuable. Silas said the house was not the main thing. He handed her the letter Vivienne had left inside the trust documentation. A single page, handwritten, with the particular precise cursive of someone who had written by hand long enough that the habit had become a style. Vivienne wrote that Ravenwood contained the original founding records of Sterling Heritage Group, including materials Conrad had been searching for without success for several years, because he understood that those materials could either protect his position or destroy it, and he had not been able to determine which. She also wrote that Naomi had 30 days in which to examine the estate, understand the condition of the company, and decide whether to accept what lay inside the trust beyond the property itself. If she sold the key or transferred custody to any member of the Sterling family, or abandoned the timeline, the trust would close and the Preservation Foundation would receive everything. The deadline was not an obstacle. It was a final piece of the same mechanism that had started with the dollar. Naomi found the box in the bedroom on her own, without anyone pointing her toward it. It was on the shelf of the wardrobe that faced the window, a lacquered case the size of a shoebox, and inside it were photographs, physical prints, of furniture she had restored, mounted in sequence, with the original condition shown beside the finished piece, the workshop invoice folded behind each set. She had never met the client who commissioned those jobs. The contact had always come through a third party, the payment had always arrived on time, and the instructions had always been oddly specific in ways she had assumed reflected an unusually knowledgeable customer. She sat on the edge of the bed with the photographs in her hands, and understood that Vivienne had been watching her work for years. She had been watching the way Naomi looked at broken things, what she decided to salvage and what she decided to leave, how she worked, and whether she kept her word. In the last line of the letter left inside the box, separate from the trust letter, written on plain paper with no formal heading, Vivienne had written that Naomi was not the poorest person in the room that afternoon, because she was the only one who had not borrowed money to maintain the appearance of being rich. Outside the window, Naomi heard the sound of cars on gravel. Then the groan of the gate being forced from the outside. Conrad had placed a vehicle behind Silas's car before the reading of the trust and followed it north. He arrived at Ravenwood with Sloan, Everett, and a private attorney, and when he walked through the gate and saw the house, intact, maintained, real, his expression did the work of a longer speech. He had known Ravenwood existed once. He had been told it was gone. He understood in that moment that his mother had maintained a deception against him for a decade and a half, which meant that everything he believed he knew about the shape of his inheritance was built on a foundation she had deliberately hollowed out. He did not say this. He said, instead, that Ravenwood was a historic family property, that a key and a letter did not constitute legal ownership, and that he expected Naomi to cooperate with the process of returning the estate to the family to which it had always belonged. Sloan walked directly into the front sitting room, without waiting for an invitation, assessed the space with the practiced eye of someone selecting a hotel suite, and told Marlene to arrange for her luggage to be brought in from the car. She did not ask. She announced it, in the way that people announce things when they have spent their entire lives in spaces where their announcements became facts by default. Naomi stood in the entrance hall and said nothing for a moment, which Sloane interpreted as confirmation that the girl who had accepted $1 in front of a laughing room was not going to find her courage in the next 60 seconds either. Conrad offered terms: $1 million, the return of the key, a confidentiality agreement covering all matters related to the estate and the trust, and Naomi's permanent relocation out of Belhaven. He said she could live comfortably on that money for the rest of her life, if she was sensible about it. Sloane added that Naomi almost certainly could not afford the property taxes on a 40-acre estate, and that accepting the offer was simply the practical choice for someone in her position. Silas produced the ownership documentation from his briefcase with no visible reaction to any of this and stated, in the measured tone he used for all facts equally, that Ravenwood was not a Sterling Group asset and had not been for 12 years, that the property had never appeared in the public record under any Sterling entity, that Naomi was the sole authorized occupant under the trust, and that everyone currently standing in the entrance hall was on private property, without the permission of its owner. Naomi looked at the people who had laughed at her 2 hours ago in a room where she had been seated at the last chair, and she took a breath that was slow enough to be deliberate and audible enough to be noticed. She asked the Ravenwood security staff, 2 men who had worked the property for years under Marlene's direction, to escort the visitors to the gate. She said it calmly and completely. "Do not cause them any harm," she said, "but make certain they understand. This door is no longer open on the name Sterling alone." The people who had watched her prove her identity to a gate guard that morning now found themselves unable to prove any right to remain inside a house they had assumed would simply absorb them as it always had. Sloane retrieved her bag from the sitting room with the particular silence of someone who has been publicly corrected and has not yet processed how to respond. Conrad stood in the driveway and made phone calls. From the window of the upstairs hallway, Naomi watched him stand at the boundary of the property he had expected to inherit, and understood something she had not understood before that moment, that she was not afraid of him. She had been afraid of him for years without knowing it. The way you are afraid of something that has always been larger and louder than you, and then one day you are standing above it and the thing itself has not changed, but your position has, and the fear goes. Before he cleared the gate, Conrad turned back and told her that a house did not make her powerful. Silas, standing behind Naomi in the doorway, said that Conrad was correct, and that the thing beneath the house might. The 30 days began. Naomi moved into Ravenwood that same evening, not because she had decided to accept the full scope of what the trust might contain, but because leaving would have been an answer she was not prepared to give yet, and she had learned a long time ago that not choosing is still a choice. Marlene walked her through the estate's archive room on the second morning, a long space lined with filing systems and shelving units, organized with a precision that suggested Vivienne had known someone specific would need to locate things in a hurry. The letter had said Ravenwood contained what Conrad had been searching for. The letter had also said that the person who could preserve Sterling's legacy would know the difference between a crack and a join. Naomi understood that this was not a metaphor about architecture. It was a description of her specific professional skill applied to a different kind of problem. She found the desk in the corner study on the third day. A Walnut Partners desk, substantial and old, the kind of piece that looked entirely original from the front but revealed, to someone who had spent years with her hands on wood in various states of repair, that the top surface had been constructed in 2 distinct periods. The original was late 19th century. The addition was considerably more recent, no more than 15 years old, set into the original with exceptional craftsmanship that a layperson would read as a natural age crack along the join. Naomi ran her fingers across it the way she ran her fingers across every piece she worked on, feeling for the seam beneath the finish, and when she pressed the join at the correct angle, a section of the surface released. The concealed compartment inside held several inches of documents in climate-controlled sleeves, Original ledgers from Sterling Heritage Group's first decade of operation, share transfer records showing a chain of ownership that differed in significant ways from the official history, minutes from board meetings that had never appeared in any public filing, and correspondence in Vivian's own hand, documenting the moment she had identified that her son was using company assets as collateral for personal investment positions she had never approved. There was also a sealed drive containing audio recordings, legally obtained, with notarization confirming the recording circumstances, from board sessions Vivian had personally attended during the period in question. There was a personnel list, hundreds of names, cross-referenced against termination schedules Conrad had prepared, employees who had been with Sterling's hotels for decades, and who were scheduled to be removed before a specific transaction closed so that the new buyers would acquire properties with leaner cost structures and no long-term staff obligations. And there was the document that made Naomi sit down on the study floor and read it twice from the beginning to make sure she had understood it correctly. The founding papers of a private holding company called Ravenwood Heritage Holdings, incorporated in Virginia, currently in possession of 53% of Sterling Heritage Group's voting shares, with all controlling rights transferred into the trust structure. The same year Vivienne had begun noticing what Conrad was building. Naomi was not the automatic successor. The trust required 3 conditions beyond accepting the property. She could not sell Ravenwood to any Sterling family member. She had to initiate an independent audit of the group's financial position, and she had to demonstrate to the trust's legal administrator that she understood the company's value was not located in its balance sheet, but in the people and history that had built it. Vivienne had not handed her a fortune. She had handed her an institution in the late stages of being dismantled from the inside and told her that the dismantling could still be stopped if the right person was willing to do the work. Naomi sat with this for a long time. She told Silas, when he came to the study to find out why she had gone quiet, that she had never run a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and that she was not certain she was the right person for this. Silas said Vivienne had not chosen someone who knew all the answers. She had chosen someone who would not sell the answers to the highest bidder, and that in the environment currently surrounding Sterling Heritage Group, those were not the same category of person. Marlene brought Naomi to a wall in the staff corridor near the archive room. It held photographs, framed, maintained, going back generations, of the men and women who had worked in Sterling's hotels, cooks, housekeepers, front desk staff who had worked the same property for 30 and 40 years. People whose entire professional lives were contained in a single building that was now on a list to be liquidated. Naomi looked at the wall for a long time. Then she told Silas to begin the audit process. That same night, Everett showed up at the East Gate alone, without Conrad. He was 29 years old and not cruel by nature, which in the Sterling family structure meant he had simply been useful in the way that people who are not cruel but are also not brave tend to be useful to people who are neither. He told Naomi that Conrad was preparing to sell 3 of the group's flagship historic properties to a speculative investment fund within the week. The fund had no interest in hospitality operations. They wanted the land and the building shells. Naomi asked why he was telling her. Everett said he had been watching the documents crossed his desk for 6 months, and had signed several of them, without reading them carefully, and that he was not ready to be the person who signed the last one. He gave her the board meeting schedule before he left. Naomi placed the sheet on Vivienne's desk next to the dollar coin and the key. Conrad's next approach was not a negotiation. It was a campaign, a distributed narrative, delivered through local press contacts and business publications, designed to establish a specific story about Naomi before she had a chance to offer another one. She was described as an estranged relative who had appeared at a deathbed to exploit a vulnerable woman's final weeks, and the phrase elderly manipulation appeared across multiple articles within days. Sloane gave an interview in which she spoke with measured sadness about the family's desire to protect Vivienne's legacy, her delivery carrying the practiced sincerity of a woman who had run a public-facing foundation long enough to understand how grief performs on camera, while Celeste confirmed to a lifestyle publication that Naomi had rarely attended family events without noting that she had rarely been invited. The practical consequences arrived quickly. Several of Naomi's established restoration clients contacted her workshop to postpone or cancel their agreements. None of them citing the press coverage directly, all of them using the softer language of timing and reassessment. Within 10 days of the inheritance reading, the workshop that had taken 5 years to build was running at a fraction of its normal revenue. The bank that carried her small business line of credit had requested a review meeting, and her primary lumber supplier had stopped returning calls. These were not coincidences. They were coordinated, and they were designed to make Naomi calculate whether continuing was worth what she might receive at the end. Conrad sent a formal offer to Ravenwood on the 12th day. $10 million for the property and all associated trust rights, with a full halt to the media coverage guaranteed the moment the transfer documents were signed. Sloan sent a separate note, handwritten on monogrammed stationery, expressing hope that Naomi would make the wise choice for her own well-being. Everett did not send anything. He had already given her what he had, and he was waiting to see whether it mattered. Conrad arrived at Ravenwood in person on the 14th evening with the offer printed and tabbed for signature, and he told Naomi, with the even tone of someone relaying financial analysis rather than delivering an ultimatum, that she could live without hardship for the remainder of her life on $10 million. He said she was a skilled craftsperson with a small business in a city that was going to stop welcoming her very shortly. He said she had a chance to leave on good terms, and that the alternative was not a situation she was equipped to manage. Naomi set the dollar coin from her pocket on top of the signature page and pushed the whole document back across the table toward him. She told him that Vivienne had paid her $1 to find out whether she could be bought. He had just confirmed the old woman was right. Conrad smiled in the way that people smile when they are no longer pretending the conversation is collegial, and said she should know. The board meeting was in 2 days, that he had the votes aligned, and that he would be confirmed as permanent chair and chief executive before her audit had produced a single finding. He said she was welcome to attend as an observer. Sloan organized a dinner the night before the board meeting at Sterling Grand Hotel, an event framed publicly as a celebration of family legacy, specifically designed to establish Conrad as the natural and inevitable continuation of Vivienne's work before any formal vote occurred. The guest list comprised board members, investors, local officials, and a carefully selected media contingent who could be trusted to produce the right kind of coverage in the right kind of tone. Naomi received an invitation. She received it because excluding her entirely would have created a story. And the story of her exclusion was less useful to Conrad than the story of her attendance, which he could characterize as a show of family unity and her implicit endorsement of the proceedings. When she arrived at Sterling Grand, her name was not on the door list. Sloan appeared in the lobby within 2 minutes of Naomi's arrival, which meant she had been informed and was prepared. And she said, in front of the photographers covering the event, that she was surprised to see someone from the trades attending a leadership gathering. She said the word trades with just enough inflection to make it clear that she was not describing a category of business, but a station of person. She nodded to a member of the hotel staff and suggested that Naomi could be directed to the service entrance. The cameras captured Naomi, standing in the lobby of the building her grandmother had built, being told she had come in through the wrong door. Naomi opened the small case Silas had prepared and removed the document it contained. An instrument confirming that Ravenwood Heritage Holdings, through its trust mechanism, owned a controlling interest in Sterling Grand Hotel and the real estate beneath it. She handed it to the hotel's general manager. Silas, who had been standing near the concierge desk, approached the room manager and explained clearly that the person without the authority to remove Naomi from the building was Sloan Sterling, who had rented the event space for an evening and confused a rental agreement with an ownership right. Naomi walked into the ballroom while Conrad was at the podium, describing his commitment to honoring his mother's vision. She did not announce herself. She sat down at a table near the center of the room and waited until he finished speaking, and then, in the pause before the applause settled, she asked 4 questions in a voice that carried far enough to be heard clearly, without needing to be raised. She asked why 3 profitable hotels were scheduled for sale to a fund with no hospitality operating history. She asked whether the board was aware that company assets had been used as collateral for personal financial positions held outside the company structure. She asked why the Sterling Family Foundation's administrative expense ratio had increased significantly in recent years, while direct program spending had not. She asked whether any board member had reviewed the full personnel action list attached to the pending transactions. Conrad said she was making accusations she could not support, that she did not understand how institutional finance operated, and that she was embarrassing herself in a room full of people who had built real things. Naomi told him that by morning, an independent audit team would be presenting its preliminary findings to the full board and its council, and that he would have the opportunity to respond to each question in the appropriate forum. She said it the way you say something that is simply true, without threat, without performance, without the kind of emotion that gives an opponent something to call hysterical. The photographers who had captured Naomi being directed toward the service entrance were now surrounding Conrad and Sloane with entirely different questions. Sloane left her own event through a side corridor before the dessert course was served. Conrad stood at the bar long enough to make one more phone call, during which he told a board member, in a voice he did not realize was carrying, that regardless of how much paperwork the woman brought to the table, she was never going to sit in his mother's chair. The board of Sterling Heritage Group met at the top floor of Sterling Tower at 9 the following morning. Naomi arrived on time. She was told by Conrad's assistant, with a politeness so thin it was nearly decorative, that the session was restricted to directors and shareholders of record, and that she was welcome to wait in the reception area until a determination of her standing could be made. Sloane walked past the reception area on her way in, and said that a beautiful old house and a dramatic entrance at a dinner party were not the same thing as a seat at a boardroom table. Everett walked past without making eye contact, which was its own answer to a question Naomi had not asked. The meeting opened with Conrad presenting a governance resolution appointing himself as permanent chair and chief executive. He had arranged the agenda so that the vote would occur before any other business, and he had arranged the proxies so that the result was, by his count, assured. He was at the midpoint of his prepared remarks when Silas entered the room. He entered alongside Naomi, a 3-person audit team with federal accounting credentials, and a legal representative holding a briefcase stamped with the name Ravenwood Heritage Holdings. Silas requested the floor under the procedural rule governing controlling shareholder intervention. The board's independent counsel, reviewing the document Silas placed on the table, confirmed the request was valid. Silas presented the ownership record. The shares held by family members under the public will represented a minority of the company's voting equity. Weighted further by restriction clauses, Vivienne had embedded years earlier that limited voting power in specific circumstances. The assets Conrad had received management authority over were encumbered with conditions that had never been disclosed to the full board. Ravenwood Heritage Holdings, through the trust that Naomi had now satisfied all preliminary conditions to activate, held 53% of the group's voting shares, and the trust administrator had confirmed her standing. She was authorized to chair the meeting. Conrad said the signature on the trust foundation documents could not be authenticated. Silas placed 3 additional items on the table: a notarized certification from the signing attorney, a medical assessment confirming Vivienne's full cognitive capacity at the time of execution, and a video recording of Vivienne herself signing the primary trust instrument in the presence of witnesses, speaking clearly about her reasoning without prompting, in a room that was not a hospital. Conrad looked at the video for several seconds. Then he looked at the chair at the head of the table, which he had arranged to face the room in a specific way. Naomi sat down in it. The audit presentation took 90 minutes. It documented losses in the mid-hundreds of millions concealed across 3 fiscal years through asset revaluations and subsidiary reclassifications. It documented personal loan collateralization using company property executed without board authorization. It documented the foundation's expenditures, a significant portion of which had been paid to vendor entities connected to personal relationships of Sloan's that had never been disclosed to the fund's oversight committee. It documented Everett's signature on a series of authorization forms, along with his own testimony, submitted that morning, confirming he had been given incomplete information at the time and had provided documentation of that fact to the audit team before the final transaction closed. Naomi exercised the 53%. She suspended Conrad from his executive role pending the outcome of the financial investigation. She halted the 3 hotel sales. She authorized an independent body to oversee the foundation's operations and freeze discretionary expenditures pending review. She protected the employment of the staff who had been placed on pre-transaction removal lists. She replaced the board members who had received advance notice of Conrad's resolution and done nothing with it. Conrad, standing at the side of the room rather than the head of the table, asked her what she knew about running a company built over 3 generations by people who were not her. Naomi set the dollar coin on the table in the center. She said she would begin by stopping the people who were born into it from finishing the job of destroying it. Conrad requested a private meeting after the session. He did not come with an apology. He came with an argument. The argument that the institutional investment community did not take guidance from craftspeople, that her legitimacy would be questioned at every significant table she sat at, that she was setting herself up for a prolonged public failure that would discredit whatever her grandmother had intended. He delivered this with the certainty of a man who believes that the most important thing he can teach someone is the size of the obstacle in front of them. Naomi told him that was precisely his failure. He had only ever looked at the price of a thing and called it value, and he had never once understood the structure that kept the thing from falling apart, which was why the institution had been quietly collapsing under his supervision for years. She did not destroy him, and that was not an accident. The decision had been made before he walked through the door, not from mercy in the abstract, but from the logic of someone who had spent years understanding what can be preserved and what must be let go. Conrad was suspended and faced a financial investigation. Sloan lost authority over the foundation and was required to make restitution for expenditures that could not be justified against its stated mission, with reinstatement possible only under a supervised structure she did not control. Celeste retained the home and allowance Vivienne had specified, with no standing in the group's affairs. Everett was offered a reduced operational role with governance training and accountability for the documents he had signed, an offer that treated him as a person who had made mistakes rather than one defined by them. Board members who had received Conrad's prearranged vote commitment and remained silent were replaced. The staff members who had sent documentation to Naomi at personal risk were invited to join an advisory council reporting directly to her office. Sloan, in one of the last conversations she had with Naomi during the restructuring period, demanded to know why she had not simply taken everything and let them learn what it felt like from the receiving end. Naomi said she did not need to reduce them to poverty to prove they had behaved badly. She only needed to ensure they no longer had the power to do it to anyone else. Sloan had no answer for this. She stood for a moment with the expression of someone who has always operated in a world where winning means the other person losing and has just encountered someone who is playing a different game entirely. Naomi signed the formal instrument, accepting the role of trust administrator and controlling interest steward of Sterling Heritage Group, a role that carried the weight of a name she had never shared and a responsibility she had not applied for. She signed it the same afternoon, with Silas as witness and Marlene standing in the doorway with the expression of someone watching something end and something else begin. Silas handed her a final envelope before he left Ravenwood that evening. It was sealed, addressed in Vivienne's handwriting, and marked with a single instruction, to be opened only after the decision about the family had been made. The letter was 2 pages. Vivienne opened it with an admission. She had made a mistake. Not the mistake of building the trust the way she built it, but the earlier mistake of allowing her silence to function as permission, of watching Naomi be treated as an outsider. At events Vivienne herself had organized and saying nothing, of allowing the logic of family politics to override the simpler logic of what was right. She said the silence had been cowardice dressed in strategy, and she was aware of the difference. She had watched Naomi restore a sideboard that had been water-damaged, stripped of its original finish, and left in a storage unit by the previous owner's descendants who had found no sentimental value in it and no practical use. She had watched Naomi spend 11 days on that piece, working with the grain of the original wood rather than against it, matching the patina rather than replacing it, and returning the object to something that was genuinely itself, rather than a reproduction of what someone thought it should be. She had understood at that point that Naomi's skill was not technical. It was a disposition, the willingness to approach a thing on its own terms, to ask what it actually was before deciding what to do with it. Sterling Heritage Group had been built on that disposition in its earliest years. Before the people running, it began confusing the group's assets with their own wealth. Vivienne explained the dollar. In the group's founding year, she had acquired the first Sterling hotel from her original business partner for the symbolic price of $1, accompanied by a verbal agreement that the employees of that hotel would be protected, that its history would be preserved, and that the buyer would treat the acquisition as a responsibility rather than a prize. Her partner had honored this. The dollar had lived in Vivienne's desk drawer for decades. She had passed the same dollar to Naomi, and with it the same obligation, which was not a burden but a starting point. Several months passed. Sterling Heritage Group stabilized under independent management appointed by the trust and reporting to Naomi's oversight. The 3 historic hotels remained open. The personnel lists were voided. The foundation was restructured under external oversight with a new expense framework. The workshop Naomi had built, which had come within days of closing during Conrad's campaign, was formalized as an independent conservation department, operating in partnership with the group's historic properties, a function that served the buildings it had always served, but now with institutional support, rather than personal risk. Ravenwood became in part a training facility for restoration and archival practice, open to people learning the trade from the ground up. Naomi lived at the estate. She did not redecorate it to signal anything about herself. She kept Vivienne's desk in the corner study and worked at it most mornings. Everett returned to the company in a junior capacity and performed his role carefully, as people sometimes do when they have been given a second chance they did not expect to receive. Sloane remained at a distance, professionally and personally, but in one of her rare direct interactions with Naomi during the restructuring period, she asked a question that was closer to genuine curiosity than anything she had expressed before, whether Naomi had known, when she accepted the dollar in front of all of them, what it would become. Naomi said she had not known. She had accepted it because it was her grandmother's decision and she was going to honor it, whatever it was. Sloane was quiet for a moment and then said nothing further, which was, in its own way, an answer. Conrad left Sterling Tower on the day his suspension took formal effect. Walking through the lobby he had used to restrict access to people he considered beneath the building. He left through the main entrance. No one stopped him. Naomi was not there to watch. She did not need to be. In the corner study at Ravenwood, she set the dollar coin in a small glass frame on the surface of Vivienne's walnut desk, next to the brass key with its engraved tag. Marlene came in to let her know the evening staff had questions about the archive room's inventory system, and before she left, she paused in the doorway and asked how long Naomi intended to keep those 2 objects there. Naomi looked out the window toward the gate at the end of the Ravenwood Drive. The gate where she had once been a person without a name on any list, standing outside while the cars of the people who mattered rolled past her. She turned back to the desk and said she would keep them there until no one in this family ever again confused the value of a person with the amount they were handed. The gate at the end of the drive stood open in the late light. Not to hide anything, not to keep anyone out. but because the estate had finally found the person it had been waiting for, and there was no longer any need to lock the door against the wrong inheritor.